This is the mission, Lieutenant.
Decontamination has failed before.
I have to hear it all,
There are
Lieutenant.
increasingly particles aboard.
Makes sense, Lieutenant.
It's from the transmission, sir.
The fault is in our monitors.
It's not clear, sir.
You mean the monitors are not clear?
I mean the fault is not clear, sir.
Particles of what?
Particles of the subject, sir.
Coming up through the monitors.
Apparently, sir.
In spite of the problems.
Connected with in some way, I believe.
The subject is on board.
Some of the personnel have seen him, sir.
Where is it now?
Who knows?
That tone is not allowed, Lieutenant.
I'm sorry, sir.
The answer then,
It comes and goes.
intermittent.
Precisely, sir.
In what form?
Elaborately, sir.
The usage is elaborate, Lieutenant.
Sorry, sir.
Elaborate, Lieutenant.
The whole deal, sir.
Execrable, Lieutenant.
I learned it when I first know, sir.
And where did the personnel
From the
learn it?
subject, sir.
Things are that bad then?
Not just the subject, sir.
You mean more than?
His surroundings, sir.
On board?
He is in the bathroom.
In his bathroom, sir?
In his bathroom, sir.
His bathroom is on
The
board.
door is closed.
You can hear him in there?
There is no sound to speak of, sir.
In your mind alone,
It
perhaps,
is coming
Lieutenant?
within a certain range.
I'm responsible for the
They wander
personnel.
around aimlessly.
What happens if the rest
They
of
do
it
not
is
travel.
under command? This could mean trouble. And after 2 hours, this is a foolish mission. 2 hours in the bathroom. 2 hours. What opportunity? I admit it's not like getting cut. The personnel. This is a mission, Lieutenant. What does that mean? Your sense has been disturbed, Lieutenant. You need a rest, Lieutenant. Help me do such a please, Lieutenant. Such as an exquisite usage. A bold advice. Such as. That can't be right. What is the context, Lieutenant? Careless reckless never right. Careless reckless never right. That can't be right. Ignorance perpetuates development. Part of the autocorrect. Prior to the autocorrect. Prior to the autocorrect. A glance to the autocorrect. Careless reckless never right. Have you heard the voice? What have you heard, Lieutenant? Screw the warnings, Lieutenant. Speak.
Prior to voice of background. Practice on herself. She sends the telegrams. She types on the end. Your mobile files. Runs. it welled up in her, passing the restrictions, leaving the restrictions behind. The voice came careless and reckless to herself, soothing her till the dampness of the legend was, etc., etc.
Don't stop now.
To touch upon her everywhere, and it aroused her together. And the voice gradually more reckless. She became a kind of singing to herself, just low singing and touching with discrimination as gradually came upon her as another presence. The fact of desire admitted to her presence, where before there had been restriction and silence. That was prior. Now the fact of the fire and the low singing, thunder on the bay,
Please, Lieutenant.
the desire.
That got him.
You're not kidding.
This came with the house
And with the concert,
and with the engines.
Indian, sir.
This is a reading of On Writing by Stephen King. This is a short book because most books about writing are filled with bullshit. Fiction writers, present company included, don't understand very much about what they do. Not why it works when it's good, not why it doesn't when it's bad. I figured the shorter the book, the less the bullshit. I was stunned by Mary Karr's memoir, The Liars Club, not just by its ferocity, its beauty, and by her delightful grasp of the vernacular, but by its totality. She is a woman who remembers everything about her early years. I am not that way. I lived an odd, herky-jerky childhood, raised by a single parent who moved around a lot in my earliest years, and who, I am not completely sure of this, may have farmed my brother and me out to one of her sisters for a while because she was economically or emotionally unable to cope with us for a time. Perhaps she was only chasing our father, who piled up all sorts of bills and then did a run out when I was 2 and my brother David was 4. If so, she never succeeded in finding him. My mother, Nellie Ruth Fillsbury King, was one of America's early liberated women, but not by choice. Mary Karr presents her childhood in an almost unbroken panorama. Mine is a fogged-out landscape from which occasional memories appear like isolated trees, the kind that look as if they might like to grab and eat you. What follows are some of those memories, plus assorted snapshots from the somewhat more coherent days of my adolescence and my young manhood. This is not an autobiography. It is rather a kind of curriculum vitae. My attempt to show how one writer was founded, not how one writer was made. I don't believe writers can be made, either by circumstances or by self-will, although I did believe those things once. The equipment comes with the original package. I believe large numbers of people have at least some talent as writers and storytellers. If I didn't believe that, writing a book like this would be a waste of time. This is how it was for me. That's all. A disjointed growth process in which ambition, desire, luck, and a little talent all played a part. Don't bother trying to read between the lines. There are no lines, only snapshots, most out of focus. When I was 5 or 6, I asked my mother if she had ever seen anyone die. Yes, she said. She had seen one person die, and had heard another one. I asked how you could hear a person die, and she told me that it was a girl who had drowned off Prout's Neck in the 1920s. She said the girl swam out past the rip, couldn't get back in, and began screaming for help. Several men tried to reach her, but that day's rip had developed a vicious undertow, and they were all forced back. In the end, they could only stand around, tourists and townies, the teenager who became my mother among them, waiting for a rescue boat that never came and listening to that girl scream until her strength gave out and she went underwater. Her body washed up in New Hampshire, my mother said. I asked how old the girl was. Mom said she was 14. They'd read me a comic book and packed me off to bed. On some other day, she told me about the one she saw. A sailor jumped off the roof of the Graymore Hotel in Portland, Maine, and landed in the street. He splattered, she said. He splattered, my mother said in her most matter-of-fact tone. She paused, then added, the stuff that came out of him was green. I've never forgotten it. That makes 2 of us, Mom.
The government is a lousy disc jockey. The kind that makes you want to lower the volume, change stations, or simply get out. But to paraphrase the Talking Heads, life during wartime, it ain't no party and it ain't no disco. It's the government trying to make people come out with their hands over their ears. In the 1989 battle to arrest Manuel Noriega in Panama and in the current standoff with the cult leader David Koresh in Waco, Texas, music has been part of the assault. During the Persian Gulf War, troops blasted heavy metal rock across the border of Kuwait. When the government has a captive audience, the tunes are definitely not designed to soothe the savage beast. Call it siege rock. The government has learned what every parent of a teenager knows. One person's top 10 is another's torture. Most people have a song they can't bear to hear ever again. A song whose first notes are both immediately recognizable and a portent of unremitting pain for the next 4 minutes. Teenagers who used to hang out at a convenience store scatter, it turns out, when store managers crank up the so-called easy listenings of Mantovani or 101 Strings. For baby boomers, the unbearable might be something from the nadir of 1970s soft rock, like Love Grows Where My Rosemary Goes, or Me and You and a Dog Named Boo. For opera fans, it might be the whooping rap of Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock's It Takes Two. And for hip-hop fans, Verde? Gauging effectiveness is never a sure thing. General Noriega was apparently unmoved by the 1960s hit parade blasted at him while he was ensconced in Panama's Vatican embassy, even if the troops were clever enough to put messages like "Nowhere to Run" and "I Fought the Law" on the sound system. With Mr. Koresh in Texas, the playlist aimed to be more harrowing. Nancy Sinatra, These Boots Are Made for Walking. A Mitch Miller chorus singing Christmas carols, an Andy Williams album, and the low, sonorous chants of Tibetan monks. Of all the songs in the world, or perhaps in Waco stores, that's what the Federal Bureau of Investigations has selected, an exercise in reverse psychology via musical taste. The cryptic assortment seems to assume that nothing could be more devastating than a combination of tacky white bread pop and exotic ritual. What kind of noise annoys a bunkered cult leader? It may not matter as long as it gets a rise out of the government's quarry. The idea is not so much to drive them from their lair as it is to reaffirm the communication process, said Robert Loudon, a former hostage negotiator who is the Associate Director of the Criminal Justice Center at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Music and almost any other noise can have an effect, and what you're looking for is a reaction to the noise. You're not exactly sure what it's going to do, and you want to be sure that it's not going to set them off like a firecracker. There's a calculated risk. The FBI will not discuss its tactics, although it did say it rejected the idea of endlessly repeating Billy Ray Cyrus's country rock hit Achy Breaky Heart. It's unknown whether that was because of the chance that the cult members might actually like the song, or because agents couldn't face the vision of the Branch Davidians doing the achy breaky dance. The Andy Williams and Mitch Miller selections may be extensions of the convenience store's easy listening strategy. And the Tibetan chanting, deep growling notes, and high whistling overtones, all produced simultaneously by each monk, could be a reminder that Mr. Koresh's religious convictions are not universally shared, or merely the FBI's idea of something so exotic it's jarring. That, in turn, raises political and religious questions. The notion of Buddhist chants as a means of aggravation does not please Tibetans for whom the chanting is a religious ritual promoting harmony and peace. If the motivation is to create harmony, to provide a peaceful means to conclude this whole fiasco, then that would be appropriate, said Sonam Wangdu, chairman of the United States Tibet Committee, a human rights group. But the use of chants to create the opposite effect, to antagonize, is very unfortunate. Yet, it shouldn't take great investigative prowess to find something that will irritate the cult beyond endurance. For brute noise, the crashing atonal metal on metal of Einstürzen Neubautens, a German band whose name translates as collapsing new buildings, and whose instrumentation includes things like oil barrels and sheet iron, could be effective. And for teeth-clenching saccharine inanity, the Archie's Sugar Sugar is just the thing. Perhaps a direct message, like Ray Charles' Hit the Road, Jack, or Napoleon XIV's They're Coming to Take Me Away, ha ha, could get through. Or the FBI's crack team of disc jockeys might think about confronting Mr. Koresh's apocalyptic Christianity with equally apocalyptic crypto-Satanism. Say, Behind the Crooked Cross by Slayer, or the more ironic but more intelligible Sympathy for the Devil by the Rolling Stones. REM's Losing My Religion could stir theological doubts. Or Making a Leap of Faith, the FBI might pump up the volume with repeated playings of Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, until the only choices are either transcendence or surrender.
I'll be reading an excerpt from Victoria Schwab's novel, A Darker Shade of Magic. Enjoy. Cal wore a very peculiar coat. It had neither one side, which would be conventional, nor two, which would be unexpected, but several, which was, of course, impossible. The first thing he did whenever he stepped out of one London and into another was take off the coat and turn it inside out, once or twice, or even 3 times, until he found the side he needed. Not all of them were fashionable, but they each served a purpose. There were ones that blended in and ones that stood out, and the one that served no purpose, but of which he was just particularly fond. So when Kel passed through the palace wall and into the anteroom, he took a moment to steady himself. It took its toll moving between worlds, and then shrugged out of his red high-collared coat and turned it inside out from right to left so that it became a simple black jacket. Well, a simple black jacket elegantly lined with silver thread and adorned with 2 gleaming columns of silver buttons. Just because he adopted a more modest palette when he was abroad, wishing neither to offend the local royalty nor to draw attention, didn't mean that he had to sacrifice style. "Oh, kings," thought Kel, as he fastened the buttons on his coat. He was starting to think like Rye. On the wall behind him, he could just make out the ghosted symbol made by his passage, like a footprint in sand already fading. He'd never bothered to mark the door from this side, simply because he never went that way. Windsor's distance from London was terribly inconvenient, considering the fact that, when traveling between worlds, Cal could only move between a place in one and the same exact place in another, which was a problem because there was no Windsor Castle, a day's journey from Red London. In fact, Cal had just come through the stone wall of a courtyard belonging to a wealthy gentleman in a town called Desan. Desan was, on a whole, a very pleasant place. Windsor was not. Impressive to be sure, but not pleasant. A marble counter ran against the wall, and on it a basin of water waited for him, as it always did. He rinsed his bloody hand, as well as the silver crown he'd used for passage, then slipped the cord it hung on over his head, and tucked the coin back beneath his collar. In the hall beyond, he could hear the shuffle of feet, the low murmur of servants and guards. He'd chosen the anteroom specifically to avoid them. He knew very well how the little Prince Regent liked him being there, and the last thing Kel wanted was an audience, a cluster of ears and eyes and mouths reporting the details of his visit back to the throne.
It is a commonplace that there is no loneliness like that of one who finds himself alone in a crowd. Novelists repeat it, the pathos is undeniable, and now, since the case of Miss V, I at least have come to believe it. Such a story as hers and her sister's, but it is characteristic that in writing of them one name seems instinctively to do for both. Indeed, one might mention a dozen such sisters in one breath. Such a story is scarcely possible except in London. In the country there would have been the butcher, or the postman, or the parson's wife, but in a highly civilized town the civilities of human life are narrowed to the least possible space. The butcher drops his meat down the area, the postman shoves his letter into the box, and the parson's wife has been known to hurl the pastoral missives through the same convenient breach. No time, they all repeat, must be wasted. So, though the meat remain uneaten, the letters unread, and the pastoral comments disobeyed, no one is any the wiser, until there comes a day when these functionaries tacitly conclude that number 16 or 23 need be attended to no longer. They skip it on their rounds, and poor Miss J or Miss V drops out of the close-knit chain of human life, and is skipped by everyone, and forever. The ease at which such a fate befalls you suggests that it is really necessary to assert yourself in order to prevent yourself from being skipped. How could you ever come to life again if the butcher, the postman, and the policeman made up their minds to ignore you? It is a terrible fate. I think I will knock over a chair at this moment. Now the lodger beneath knows that I am alive at any rate. But to return to the mysterious case of Miss V, in which initial, be it understood, is concealed the person also of Miss Janet V, it is hardly necessary to split one letter into two parts. They have been gliding about London for some 15 years. You were to find them in certain drawing-rooms or picture galleries, and when you said, "Oh, how do you do, Miss V?" as though you have been in the habit of meeting her every day of your life, she would answer, "Isn't it a pleasant day?" or "What bad weather we are having." And then you moved on, and she seemed to melt into some armchair or chest of drawers. At any rate, you thought no more of her until she detached herself from the furniture in a year's time, perhaps, and the same things were said over again. A tie of blood, or whatever the fluid was that ran in Miss V's veins, made it my particular fate to run against her, or pass through her, or dissipate her, whatever the phrase may be, more constantly, perhaps, than any other person, until this little performance became almost a habit. No party, or concert, or gallery seemed quite complete unless the familiar grey shadow was part of it. And when some time ago she ceased to haunt my path, I knew vaguely that something was missing. I will not exaggerate and say that I knew that she was missing, but there is no insincerity in using the neuter term. Thus, in a crowded room, I began to find myself gazing round in nameless dissatisfaction. No, everyone seemed to be there, but surely there was something lacking in furniture or curtains. Or was it that the print was moved from the wall? Then, one morning early, waking at dawn indeed, I cried aloud, "Mary V! Mary V!" It was the first time, I am sure, that anyone had ever cried her name with such conviction. Generally it seemed a colourless epithet, used merely to round a period. But my voice did not, as I half expected, summon the person or resemblance of Miss V before me. The room remained vague. All day long my own cry echoed in my brain, till I made certain that at some street corner or another I should come across her as usual, and see her fade away, and be satisfied. Still she came not, and I think I was discontented. At any rate, the strange, fantastic plan came into my head as I lay awake at night, a mere whim at first, which grew serious and exciting by degrees, that I would go and call on Mary V. in person. Oh, how mad and odd and amusing it seemed, now that I thought of it, to track down the shadow, to see where she lived, and if she lived, and talk to her as though she were a person like the rest of us. Consider how it would seem to set out in an omnibus to visit the shadow of a bluebell in Kew Gardens, when the sun stands halfway down the sky, or to catch the down from a dandelion at midnight in a Surrey meadow. Yet it was a much more fantastic expedition than any of these that I proposed, and as I put on my clothes to start, I laughed and laughed to think that such substantial preparation was needed for my task. Boots and hat for Mary V. It seemed incredibly incongruous. At length I reached the flat where she lived, and looking at the signboard I found it stated ambiguously, like the rest of us, that she was both out and in. At her door, high up in the topmost story of the building, I knocked and ran, and waited and scrutinized. No one came, and I began to wonder if shadows could die. and how one buried them, when the story was gently opened by a maid. Mary V. had been ill for 2 months. She had died yesterday morning, at the very hour when I called her name. So I shall never meet her shadow any more.
I will be reading an excerpt from Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. Robert Kiyosaki was an American businessman who grew up with two dads. His real father, who was his poor dad, and the father of his best friend, who was his rich dad. Both men helped shape his thoughts about money and investing. One of the reasons the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and the middle class struggles in debt is that they're at home and not in school. Most of us learn about money from our parents. So what can poor parents tell their child about money? They simply say, stay in school and study hard. The child may graduate with excellent grades, but with a poor person's financial programming and mindset. Sadly, money is not taught in schools. Schools focus on scholastic and professional skills, but not on financial skills. This explains how smart bankers, doctors, and accountants who earn excellent grades may struggle financially all of their lives. Our staggering national debt is due in large part to highly educated politicians and government officials making financial decisions with little or no training in the subject of money. Today, I often wonder, what will soon happen when we have millions of people who need financial and medical assistance? They will be dependent upon their families or the government for financial support. What will happen when Medicare and Social Security run out of money? How will a nation survive if teaching children about money continues to be left to parents, most of whom will be or are already poor? Because I had two influential fathers, I learned from both of them. I had to think about each dad's advice, and in doing so, I gained valuable insight into the power and effect of one's thoughts on one's life. For example, one dad had a habit of saying, I can't afford it. The other dad forbade those words to be used. He insisted I ask, how can I afford it? One is a statement and the other is a question. One lets you off the hook and the other forces you to think. My soon-to-be rich dad would explain that by automatically saying the words, I can't afford it, your brain stops working. By asking the question, how can I afford it, your brain is put to work. He did not mean that you should buy everything you want. He was fanatical about exercising your mind, the most powerful computer in the world. He'd say, my brain gets stronger every day because I exercise it. The stronger it gets, the more money I can make. He believed that automatically saying I can't afford it was a sign of mental laziness. Although both dads worked hard, I noticed that one dad had a habit of putting his brain to sleep when it came to finances, and the other had a habit of exercising his brain. The long-term result was that one dad grew stronger financially and the other grew weaker. It is not much different from a person who goes to the gym to exercise on a regular basis versus someone who sits on the couch watching television. Proper physical exercise increases your chances for health, and proper mental exercise increases your chances for wealth. That is the end of this excerpt. Thank you.
Slick Rick's children's story was one of many hip-hop classics my mother played for me during grade school. In it, he illustrates a tale of cops and robbers, a dope fiend named Dave, a pregnant damsel, an old hostage, and two impressionable nephews with their eccentric uncle. An entire world built in under 5 minutes. I was enamored with the story and fascinated by a rapper who wrote not just as a songwriter, but as a creative author. Hip-hop has a long lineage of exceptional narrators, and while stylistic changes over the last 4 decades have altered the approach many artists take with their music, the basis of most rap songs is still fundamental storytelling. Slick Rick's gift for worldly constructions has inspired minds, but it can't be replicated easily. Still, there's an astounding number of artists, new and old alike, who approach their craft with new and inventive blueprints to bring imagined ideas to auditory life. One particular approach to tale-telling that isn't acknowledged enough is that told from an outsider's perspective, when a rapper leaves his or her own shoes and enters new skin, giving voice to a person or object unfamiliar to the audience. J. Cole's 4th studio album, For Your Eyes Only, sees the North Carolina rapper build his concept on the back of another man's story. Cole presents the life and death of a late childhood friend, assigning the pseudonym James McMillan Jr. Cole's attentive concern for details ascends his previous artistic ceiling as a writer. The track bearing the same name, For Your Eyes Only, is an 8-minute collection of memories leading up to the man's final moments, with Cole fulfilling the request he promised to complete, making the album as a historical keepsake for James's surviving daughter. As the listener, we enter the mind of a man nearing death's suffocating grip, understanding what his world was like as the Reaper crept closer. Even the way Cole delivers his verses carries a certain rasp that makes the song feel like an out-of-body experience. By taking himself out of the equation and becoming the author of James's unfortunate outcome, Cole allows the audience to absorb the song and album in a way that wouldn't be possible if he told the story from his own point of view. There's a certain level of intricate focus necessary to build narratives and identities for outside characters. Cole's For Your Eyes Only wouldn't have worked as a song or an album without considering all the nuances of telling another man's story. This same perspective is what makes Eminem's Stan such a breathtaking tale of deranged hero worship and obsessive fandom. M had to become Stan, give him a world with a wife, a nephew, and a burning desire to reach a man he only knew from afar. Building the story around letters and voice recordings allowed for both Stan and M to issue a final response as isolated narration, a dialogue connected without requiring the two to directly communicate. From a friend's death to a fifth of vodka, we entered the disturbing world of Stan as a display of the disillusionment between fan and artists. Vic Mensa's track Heaven on Earth notably took cues from Stan as he comes to grips with the murder of a friend. In the telling of the tale, Vic allows both the victim and the murderer to speak, giving the track a sense of completeness. And while some rappers like Eminem have the inventiveness to conjure a fictional entity to voice a worldview, many have walked a similar path as J. Cole and used songs passed down the tales of men who were either once alive or still are. The game recreated the final moments of Tupac, Biggie, and Eazy-E's lives on his song Never Can Say Goodbye. It begins with breaking news clips from their passings. The Compton-born rapper is in rare form as he vocally does his best imitation of each artist, not only stepping into their minds, but channeling their unique cadences and deliveries as well. Game is many things, but above all else, he's a student of the greats, and his homage immortalizes the last minutes of the lives of 3 lost legends. While the game focused solely on death and Never Can Say Goodbye, Nas's track UBR sees him craft a song around the life of Rakim. It stands for the unauthorized biography of Rakim. In under 4 minutes, Nasir gives listeners a detailed history lesson on the legendary MC, converting an impressive amount of information into rhyme. Beyond the boundaries of humanity, personification is a literary device many rappers have used to bring surrealism into rap's authentic reality. 50 Cent's A Baltimore Love Thing turns Curtis Jackson into the aggressive, manipulative mouthpiece for heroin. Expertly, he made the highly addictive drug sound like an abusive lover, while describing what it does to the mind once puncturing the vein. Nobody Believes Me by Styles P brings listeners into what can only be described as a weed-induced dream, while the rapper's knife, gun, haze, and money all begin to speak to him with humorless precision. The genre's practitioners may never receive the same accolades, recognition, or respect as writers in literature. Still, rap is filled with some of the best stories and storytellers in the world.
Walter Marchetti, generous, vivacious, full of humor. A recording contract from me in Italian. I don't understand a word. A large lawyer behind a grand walnut desk. I don't know what I'm signing. Maybe my life. Walter is with me. He is smiling. The lawyer doesn't speak very good English. Walter says to me softly, "Sign it. A piece of paper doesn't mean anything. You are an anarchist. Sign it." Good advice, a true friend. Modest, too modest. Enclosed in a large sphere of solitude, the boundaries of the sphere are tangible. I penetrate the sphere with caution, as though approaching a rare animal, long thought to be extinct. A person of civility and elegance, perhaps truly extinct. Elegance that is perhaps truly extinct. John Cage said to Mimi Johnson, "You must bring to America. These are the only composers of genius and dignity." Mimi calls me in California and says, "Well?" I say, "Of course. Genius and dignity radiate thousands of miles. I know that Walter Marchetti, because of the radiation of the genius and the dignity." Later, he and Juan Hidalgo and Esther Ferrer appear at the bus station in Oakland, California. Genius and dignity light up the humble landscape of the bus station in Oakland, California. I have never felt such presence. They give 2 concerts. The American audiences are baffled and arrogant, hostile to brilliance. An hour of almost silence, the most modest and sweet sounds in my experience. In Walter's piece, a kind of roar. The audiences are baffled. Maybe the important concerts of my life. A kind of dignity long lost, perhaps truly extinct. We stay together for a week. I cook terrible Italian food. Walter says, "It's delicious." I'm stunned with the combination of forgivingness and elegance. Poor Walter, Oakland, California. Terrible Italian food. It's delicious. We go to the ocean. We eat oysters. Probably there is something wrong with them. Walter doesn't feel well, and neither do I. It was a wonderful experience. Thank you, Walter. We speak about my work. My work. Not Walter's work. I have a tape that is the ruins of a work that possibly I could have been proud of. All the materials of weeks of work have been stolen. The tape is a crude mix, made on the spur of the moment. The ruins of possibly a good piece. Walter says, it's wonderful. I think Walter appreciates ruins. He causes it to be published as a recording. Years later, Mimi and I visit Walter in Milan. Again, the inviolable sphere of generosity and modesty. I am humbled. We should all live in this way. And still the sphere of solitude, the impenetrable sphere of solitude. This is the place of great art. I don't mean Milan. I mean the impenetrable sphere of solitude. If only I could learn that. Then finally, Natura Morta arrived. The most dignified and elegant recording I have ever heard. I play it whenever I need to be reminded not to make noise. It soothes my spirit. It cures me of my bad habits. I notice that in the picture, Walter is looking down, not facing the camera. Modesty and the impenetrable sphere of solitude. A great imagination inside the sphere of solitude. Thank you, Walter.
All right, this is going to be considered my interesting space. This is in my stairwell, which has a ceiling that leads up to a skylight, so it's got a lot of open space.
Right now, I am recording inside of a kitchen cabinet. I find it to be very interesting. I like it because it's dark, there's only plates and cups, and I'm very excited to see how the audio will come out.
Hi, I'm recording this with my head inside of our front-facing washing machine. Don't worry, I was not harmed in the process of recording this. I've got to admit, though, this probably isn't the best place to record.
It's out of her field, but Patricia can't let it go. Clear cuts increase wind throw, and crown fires only happen when fires are suppressed for too long. She lays it out. Fire regenerates. There are cones.
Right now, I'm recording my interesting space. I am currently sitting in a tree, right here on my front lawn, baking in the sun. But don't worry, the tree isn't that high off the ground.